Well, I think that, I feel it more as responsibility than pressure. This book, it was an opportunity. This book resonated with so many people. And so it was our...
They thought this would stay quiet, that no one would notice, that creators would stay distracted. But what started as whispers is now a roar. Because something strange is happening across the internet, and the lawsuit involving Blake Lively has become something else entirely. This is no longer just about legal documents or defamation. This is about control, about silence, about why so many creators are suddenly backing away from content they once freely discussed. This is about those quiet messages, the unexplained flags, the calls that never get returned, and the partnerships that vanish overnight, all while a powerful narrative tries to stay intact. But creators are waking up, and so is the audience. They are digging deeper, connecting dots, and asking questions no one wanted asked. Why are subpoenas reaching people barely connected? Why are platforms acting strangely? Why are journalists suddenly interested in what seemed like celebrity drama? There is something bigger behind this lawsuit. And every frame, every video, every document is one step closer to the truth. If you think this is just about court, think again. The real battle is for your voice, and the people trying to stop you from using it are about to be exposed. They said nothing. At first, the silence from Blake Lively's side was not surprising to some, but to others, it spoke volumes. Louder than any official statement. Could have, because when questions started swirling about the lawsuit and the public began noticing patterns, the one thing they were not prepared for was how deep this story would go. What started as a relatively small legal action quickly evolved into a massive web of confusion, suspicion, strategy, and silence, and in the middle of it all was a woman, which was a woman who once commanded adoration with a smile and now found herself navigating a media storm with calculated quietness. The documents that initially appeared bland and procedural were dissected line by line by creators and legal minds who saw more than legal jargon. They saw timing, they saw silence, they saw sudden PR pushes that coincided with troubling legal updates every time a new court document was quietly filed, a magazine cover would hit the stands, or a throwback photo would surface on social media, reminding everyone of the Blake they remembered, polished, gracious, untouched by controversy. But the timing started to raise eyebrows. Every positive feature seemed to conveniently arrive within days of negative developments in the case, and creators began connecting the dots one by one, piece by piece. Not in a conspiratorial way, but with receipts, screenshots, and timelines that painted a picture of narrative control and curated silence. This was not just a legal defense, it was a strategic battle to protect a brand, to protect control, to protect what some now felt was an image built on illusion. And once those questions were asked, they could not be unasked. Creators from different corners of the internet who had nothing to gain began posting about sudden shadow bans, strange drops in engagement, broken brand deals, and unreturned messages. And at first these claims seemed isolated, coincidental even, but then more surfaced and more, until it could no longer be dismissed as a pattern that didn't exist. People were connecting across platforms, across niches, across locations, comparing notes, seeing overlaps in their stories, and one question kept surfacing: was this all connected? Was there something bigger underneath all of this? And was the lawsuit the tip of the iceberg? Because if creators were being impacted just for questioning a public narrative, then what did that mean about the tools being used to maintain that narrative? Legal experts began weighing in, noting unusual procedural strategies, multiple sealed documents, and redacted communications that were rarely seen in similar defamation filings. And this wasn't just speculation. These were verified filings, statements that were made in court under oath, filings that hinted at pressure behind the scenes and the unsettling suggestion that the story being presented to the public was only a fraction of what was unfolding inside courtrooms and back-channel negotiations. And amidst all this, Justin Baldone, who was at the center of the lawsuit, remained consistent, quiet, yes, but steady. Not launching accusations, not spiraling into drama, but trusting the legal process to play out while around him. The digital world roared with commentary, some supportive, some skeptical, but all demanding clarity. At one point, the creators themselves became part of the story, those who spoke out, those who documented, those who connected the dots. And the backlash they faced became undeniable. Algorithmic dips, unexplained copyright strikes, influencer groups suddenly going silent when asked about Blake or the lawsuit or anything related to what they once freely commented on. The chilling effect was real and documented, and that fear of speaking truth became the very reason others chose to speak louder. Not in anger, not with hate, but with persistence, because the more silence tried to close the door, the more people pushed it open. This wasn't about sides, this was about transparency. And slowly the media began catching on, not traditional outlets at first, but investigative digital journalists, independent channels, podcast hosts who reviewed court documents, interviewed lawyers, and collected creator testimonies. They saw the patterns. And the story started to gain traction, not as a scandal, but as a reflection of how power moves in a digital age, how image can sometimes override truth, and how lawsuits can shape the narrative more than the actual facts. The question everyone started asking was simple. Why so much effort for a defamation case? What exactly was at stake? Because lawsuits happen all the time in Hollywood, between celebrities and creators, between networks and talent, but this one felt different. It felt like it was about more than clearing a name. It felt like it was about control, and the creators who were once dismissed as overreacting suddenly looked prophetic as more details began to emerge. When unsealed filings showed strategic delays, attempts to block subpoenas, and a strangely aggressive pushback against requests for discovery, people started reevaluating their assumptions. This wasn't about damage control anymore. It was about preserving something very specific, a reputation, a brand, perhaps even a future project. And that led to one of the most debated topics across creator spaces. Why was there so little support from Hollywood? Why were once outspoken allies silent now? What deals were in place, and what conversations were being had behind closed doors that made people hesitate to speak? And even more interestingly, who was still willing to speak when the risks were clear? The creators who continued to tell the story became anchors in the storm, not journalists, perhaps not legal experts, but documenters, truth seekers, trying to provide clarity in a fog of curated media and public relations. The deeper they went, the more they uncovered, not just about the case, but about the mechanics of reputation building and reputation shielding. They uncovered how platforms can quietly suppress content without explanation, how influence is wielded subtly through access and opportunity, how legal strategy is sometimes used not only to win a case, but to discourage inquiry altogether. And all the while, Blake Lively remained mostly out of the spotlight. Not vanishing, not hiding, but carefully choosing when and how to appear. Her team issuing statements that sounded neutral but carried clear strategic weight. Meanwhile, those watching the case unfold found themselves asking whether this was about justice or something else, whether truth was really the goal, or whether truth is just an inconvenience to be managed like a press cycle or an image adjustment. And still the creators pressed on, not because they hated anyone, not because they had anything to gain, but because they saw something worth examining, something that wasn't just about one lawsuit or one celebrity, but about a pattern that could repeat if left unchecked. They weren't trying to destroy a reputation, they were trying to understand why so much energy was being spent hiding something that could be clarified with transparency. And now that the conversation had reached this level, the question became, what next? What happens when creators who rely on platforms begin questioning the platforms themselves? What happens when legal threats do not silence the conversation but amplify it? What happens when silence becomes the story and when power no longer moves quietly? The creators knew the risks, but they also knew that staying silent meant accepting a future where Speaking up was punished, and questions were labeled as attacks. And in that environment, no one was safe, not the creators, not the viewers, not even the public figures themselves. And so they kept going, not to bring anyone down, but to lift up the right to ask, to challenge, and to share. And that is where part 1 leaves us, a digital community facing a moment of reckoning. Not about one lawsuit, but about the systems that decide what is seen, what is silenced. And what happens when the truth is more powerful than the image? What happened next was not a plot twist. It was more like a slow realization, the kind that settles. And after weeks of silence and confusion, a growing sense that something much larger had been set in motion than anyone initially understood. Creators began noticing patterns, not just in how their content was treated, but in the way certain narratives started gaining traction as if from nowhere, with strangely similar wording. Influencers who had never posted about legal issues suddenly expressing support for one side, quiet reshuffles in public statements, and an eerie rise in curated staters posts, all suggesting that the digital era was being shaped behind the scenes. The creators involved, many of whom had only briefly commented on the legal drama, began receiving messages not just from fans or trolls, but from supposed PR professionals asking them to take down posts, to clarify language, to be careful with assumptions. Some requests were polite, others less so, but all carried the same message: stay quiet or speak carefully. Even more strange was how those who ignored the suggestions began facing subtle consequences. Channels demonetized, sponsors pulling out without explanation, collaborations suddenly dropped, invitations rescinded, and it wasn't just happening to one or two. This was systemic, a wave of silence rolling through a once vocal space, and yet, even in that silence, new voices began to emerge. Smaller creators with nothing to lose, sharing screenshots, emails, and private teams that painted a picture of quiet pressure. And behind the scenes influence, a Google Doc began circulating, filled with examples, timelines, and anonymized stories. Each entry adding a layer of credibility to the claims, each line whispering that this was real, that this was happening. The court case itself was evolving to motions once buried in legalese were being translated by legal influencers for the public to understand. And what they found was startling. There were accusations of improper filings, of deadlines missed. Then, suddenly, met with hours to spare, of unusual redactions and witnesses who no longer appeared without explanation. The legal team representing Blake Lively was operating with precision and intensity, and while that might be expected in high-profile cases, the contrast between the silence on the public front and the aggressiveness in court was striking. Some speculated that the strategy was clear: control the narrative, both legally and publicly, at all costs, protect the image at all costs. But the image was already cracking. Influencers were sharing private experiences that aligned to perfectly, to ignore stories of emails that vanished, messages that never arrived, and content flagged for reasons that made no sense when reviewed independently. The phrase algorithmic targeting began appearing in creator circles, suggesting that suppression might be technological, not just social. The media began to pay more attention this time, not to the lawsuit itself, but to the pattern of silencing that seemed to surround it. Op-eds emerged, not accusing anyone directly, but asking questions, the kind that demanded answers. Why were certain voices being elevated and others buried? Why did timelines of brand partnerships shift so suddenly? And why were those who simply asked questions about the case being treated as if they'd crossed a line that no one could define? It became clear that the Blake Lively lawsuit was no longer just a legal issue. It was becoming a cultural one, a test of how power moves in the age of the internet, how image is curated, and how dissent is managed. By the time part 2 of the story fully unfolded, creators were banding together, not to cancel or attack, but to stay visible, to stay connected, and to remind each other that they were not imagining what was happening. Whisper networks turned into Discord servers, then into group calls, then into collaborative Content each step, a quiet rebellion against the fear of speaking too loudly or questioning too openly. Some described it as the digital version of passing. Notes in class, a way to share truth without getting caught. The platforms themselves started facing questions to why were certain posts being flagged, what were the guidelines being used, and why were enforcement patterns so inconsistent? Was there a connection between the legal case and the moderation decisions being made, or was this all a coincidence? The platforms did not answer, not directly, at least their responses were generic, restating policies and community guidelines, but the timing, the patterns, the coincidences, they were too frequent to ignore, and so the public kept watching, not with outrage, but with curiosity, not with accusations, but with questions, and that curiosity was starting to shift the tide. The once polished narrative now had visible cracks, and from those cracks came stories, truths, and a growing demand for transparency. As the second phase of this unfolding digital drama reached its peak, what remained was not a clear answer, but a clear shift. Something had changed, and there was no going back. The lawsuit had sparked something deeper than anyone expected, and the next chapter was poised to reveal even more than the first. As the third wave of revelations began rising, the tension was no longer just about who said what or which legal team filed first. It had become a question of influence, of power, of what happens when public platforms are no longer neutral, when narratives are nudged, when perception is subtly managed, and when creators once seen as independent begin to realize they may not be as free as they believed. There was a growing sense that this lawsuit had become a mirror, a way for everyone involved to examine how closely tied image and truth had become, and in that mirror, uncomfortable reflections were staring back. Influencers who once stayed silent, fearing backlash, began to reconsider their stance. Not out of defiance, but because the silence itself was starting to feel like complicity, and so they began to speak slowly, carefully, not with anger, but with precision, recounting odd incidents, unexplained flags, algorithmic changes, and brands that suddenly backed away from collaborations they had been excited about. Ours. Before, nothing was definitive, nothing provable on its own, but when the pieces were assembled, it was impossible to ignore the shape forming before them. Meanwhile, Blake Lively's legal team remained firm, focused, and unflinching, releasing carefully worded statements and doubling down on their positions in court, but each move only seemed to intensify the interest, as if the very effort to contain the story was making it grow larger, and creators, now emboldened by community, began dissecting every public record, every court document, looking for patterns and meaning, and they were finding them. They noticed filings that included names no one had seen before, subpoenas sent to individuals who had made content barely tangential to the case, requests for data that seemed more exploratory than targeted. The scope was widening, and with it, so was the concern. What had started as a dispute between two parties had now expanded into a broader inquiry about digital accountability. Creators were no longer just asking about the lawsuit, they were asking why it seemed to ripple so far and so fast, why it had affected people with only distant ties to the situation, and whether the legal system was being used not just to seek justice, but to shape the digital conversation itself. The media response evolved accordingly, moving from celebrity gossip to investigative reporting outlets, once hesitant to touch the story, began commissioning journalists to dive deeper, and what they found were testimonies from individuals who had been asked to sign non-disclosure agreements without context, who had received vague but insistent messages suggesting they reconsider their online commentary. One even described a conversation where a third party hinted that continuing to cover the case might affect future partnership opportunities. The implication was never direct, never written, but the intent was clear. These were not just legal strategies, they were narrative strategies. The effort to control the story had become as intricate as the case itself, and that raised a larger question: who benefits from silence? And more importantly, who decides what stories are too sensitive to tell? Creators felt this keenly, especially those who had grown their channels on transparency, authenticity, and courage. Now those very values seemed risky, and yet they pressed on not with recklessness but with resolve, hosting panels, creating long-form breakdowns, inviting experts to unpack the legalese, so the public could understand what was happening, not from speculation, but from fact. They knew that context was everything, and that if they could keep the public informed, they could push back against the fog of confusion that had settled over the case. And they were not alone. Tech analysts stepped in, reviewing how platform behavior had shifted. Data scientists showed visualizations of content visibility changes in the months following key moments in the lawsuit. And those visualizations told a story not of censorship but of influence, a quiet nudging, a set of changes that when viewed individually seemed minor, but when placed together revealed a pattern. Something was moving behind the curtain, and people were starting to see the strings. The third act of this unfolding digital saga was not defined by outrage, but by inquiry. It was about asking questions loudly enough that they could not be ignored, and those questions began drawing the attention of public figures, politicians, digital rights advocates, and even former employees from within the platforms themselves, some speaking anonymously, others stepping into the light, all echoing the same sentiment. The line between public interest and private control was being blurred, and this lawsuit was exposing that blur in real time. The case was still ongoing. The legal motions continued. The statements were issued. The appearances were made, but the story had grown beyond the courtroom. It was now embedded in the culture, in the algorithms, in the very infrastructure of online discourse, and those who once watched from a distance now found themselves asking what role they played in amplifying or suppressing the voices around them, because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore, and the pressure to remain neutral was giving way to a need for clarity. As Part 3 came to a close, the questions loomed larger than the answers, but the determination to uncover those answers had never been stronger. The creators, the commentators, the audiences, they were no longer waiting to be told what was happening. They were deciding for themselves, and in doing so, they were reclaiming a narrative that had slipped too far. And now, as the final pieces begin to shift, as names once hidden start to emerge, and as the silence surrounding this case starts to crack, the world is left watching, wondering what happens next, because this was never just about one creator or one celebrity. It was about what happens when power meets resistance, when truth refuses to be buried, and when stories refuse to fade away. The lawsuit continues, the pressure builds, and the platform itself becomes part of the story. You are not just watching, you are witnessing a moment that could redefine what it means to speak freely, to challenge, influence, and to demand answers where none were given. The next move could change everything, and the people who thought they were in control may no longer be holding the cards, because in the end, it is not about winning a case. It is about revealing what was meant to stay hidden, and now that the world is looking, it may already be too late to turn back. Keep watching, keep questioning, because the next chapter is coming, and no one is ready for what it will reveal.